Imagine standing on Fifth Avenue in New York City today. Around you are luxury stores, office towers, hotels, and apartment buildings. Traffic moves through the streets, crowds pass beneath glowing storefronts, and almost nothing suggests that this was once the center of an American dynasty. But if you could rewind the city by a little more than 100 years, the entire landscape would change. In place of modern commercial buildings, you would see enormous private residences made of limestone, marble, and carved wood. Some looked like French castles. Others resembled Italian palaces. Their interiors contained private galleries, ballrooms, libraries, tapestries, imported fireplaces, and entire rooms reconstructed from European estates. And many of them belonged to the same family. The Vanderbilts built such a concentration of residences along Fifth Avenue that the area became known as Vanderbilt Row. These were not simply expensive houses. They were public declarations of wealth, social arrival, and permanence. And almost all of them are gone. Not abandoned, not slowly reduced to ruins, demolished. Some disappeared so completely that thousands of people now walk across the places where they once stood without knowing that anything was ever there. The family that built them had controlled one of the greatest private fortunes in American history. Cornelius Vanderbilt created an empire from steamships and railroads. His son expanded it. His grandchildren transformed that fortune into mansions, art collections, parties, and social power. Yet within a few generations, the fortune had been divided, many of the homes had been sold, and the most visible symbols of the dynasty had been erased from the city. This is not simply a story about rich people losing expensive houses. It is a story about how cities change, how fortunes fragment, and how quickly something built to look permanent can disappear. Welcome back to Old Money Dynasty. This channel explores the families that built enormous fortunes, the worlds they created, the mistakes they made, and the lessons buried inside their legacies. Today, we are looking beyond the Vanderbilt properties that everyone already knows. The Breakers still stands in Newport. Biltmore still rises above the mountains of North Carolina. Marble House, the Hyde Park mansion, and several other estates survived as museums, institutions, or historic landmarks. But those surviving properties can create the illusion that the Vanderbilt architectural empire is still mostly intact. It is not. The surviving homes represent only fragments of a much larger world. The real story includes the mansions that were dismantled, redeveloped, burned, sold, or erased before the modern preservation movement had the power to save them. To understand why the houses mattered, we first have to understand the scale of the fortune behind them. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born on Staten Island in 1794. He came from a working family and entered the transportation business as a young man. Over the following decades, he built his wealth through shipping and later through railroads. He was aggressive, disciplined, and often ruthless. He understood transportation networks, consolidation, and competition better than most of his rivals. By the time he died in 1877, his fortune was estimated at approximately $100 million. Converted through ordinary inflation, that would equal several billion dollars today. Measured as a share of the American economy, however, his wealth would place him among the richest Americans who ever lived. That distinction matters. There is no perfect way to compare a 19th century railroad fortune with the wealth of a modern billionaire. But there is no question that Vanderbilt controlled resources on a scale that was extraordinary even among the industrial giants of his own era. Cornelius did not distribute his fortune equally among his children. He left the overwhelming majority to his son, William Henry Vanderbilt. That decision was controversial, but it reflected a clear fear. If the fortune were divided too widely, the power of the family would begin to dissolve. William Henry did more than preserve the inheritance. During the 8 years between his father's death and his own, he expanded the family's holdings and reportedly increased the fortune to approximately $200 million. This was the moment when Vanderbilt wealth became almost mythological. The first generation had built the empire. The second generation enlarged it. The next generation would display it, and there was no more visible place to display wealth than Fifth Avenue. In the late 19th century, the avenue was transforming into one of the most fashionable residential corridors in the United States. New York's wealthiest families constructed homes there, but the Vanderbilts created a concentration unlike almost any other family. Their residences were so numerous and so imposing that the neighborhood became identified with their name. One of the most extraordinary was the William Henry Vanderbilt double mansion at 640 Fifth Avenue. Completed in the early 1880s, the structure consisted of two connected residences. One side was occupied by William Henry and his wife, while the other was associated with members of the family. The house was designed not only as a residence, but as a setting for an enormous art collection. Its rooms contained elaborate woodwork, imported furnishings, paintings, sculpture, and decorative objects. William Henry even commissioned a published catalog documenting his collection. That detail tells you almost everything about the social world the Vanderbilts had entered. The mansion was not meant to remain private in the ordinary sense. Its existence was part of the family's public identity. The house demonstrated that the Vanderbilts were no longer merely railroad owners. They were patrons, collectors, and members of the cultural elite. Yet the double mansion did not survive. As Fifth Avenue became increasingly commercial, the value of the land began to compete with the value of the house itself. Eventually, the property was sold and demolished. Then there was the residence of William Kissam Vanderbilt at 660 Fifth Avenue. Designed by Richard Morris Hunt and completed in 1883, it was modeled after a French chateau. Its carved limestone exterior was dramatically different from many of the more traditional brownstone homes surrounding it. The house helped change the architectural character of Fifth Avenue. It announced that American industrial wealth could commission residences with the scale and theatrical detail of European aristocratic architecture. The mansion was admired, criticized, and discussed. It became one of the most recognizable private residences in the city. But in 1926, it was demolished. A building that had been designed to proclaim the arrival of a dynasty survived for only a little more than 4 decades. The largest and most spectacular Vanderbilt residence in Manhattan belonged to Cornelius Vanderbilt II. It stood at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street and expanded over time until it became one of the largest private homes ever constructed in New York City. Accounts commonly describe it as containing more than 100 rooms. Its scale was difficult to comprehend. This was not simply a large townhouse. It occupied an enormous piece of one of the most valuable corners in Manhattan and presented itself almost like a European palace transported into the center of New York. Cornelius Vanderbilt II and his wife, Alice, used the house as one of the principal stages of Gilded Age society. Its rooms were created for formal dinners, receptions, art, and social display. But by the 1920s, the world that had produced the mansion was disappearing. The neighborhood had changed. Commercial development was moving north. Property values were rising. The cost of operating a house of that size was enormous, requiring large numbers of servants, constant maintenance, and substantial yearly spending. After Cornelius died, Alice continued to live there for years. Eventually, however, the property was sold. The mansion was demolished in 1927, and the Bergdorf Goodman building later rose on the site. A small piece of the estate survived. The mansion's gates were preserved and moved to the Conservatory Garden in Central Park. They still stand there today. Those gates are more than decorative remains. They are evidence of how completely the rest of the house vanished. A person can pass through them without realizing that they once guarded one of the grandest private residences in the United States. And the Fifth Avenue mansions were only one part of the Vanderbilt building campaign. In Newport, Rhode Island, the family constructed summer homes that were politely called cottages, even though they contained dozens of rooms and required staffs larger than many hotels. The Breakers is the most famous. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built the present mansion after an earlier wooden house on the property burned in 1892. Rather than replacing it with another conventional summer residence, the family commissioned a much larger and more fire-resistant building made with stone, steel, marble, and other durable materials. Completed in the 1890s, the Breakers contained approximately 70 rooms and drew inspiration from Italian Renaissance palaces. It survived, and because it survived, it now shapes the way many people imagine the Vanderbilts. But survival was not guaranteed. The Breakers endured because later owners and preservationists eventually protected it. Other properties were not as fortunate. Marble House, built for William Kissam Vanderbilt and Alva Vanderbilt, was another defining residence. It was designed by Richard Morris Hunt and inspired by European classical architecture, particularly the Petit Trianon at Versailles. The house was part residence and part social weapon. Alva Vanderbilt understood that architecture could be used to force entry into established society. The Vanderbilts had immense wealth, but old New York families often viewed them as socially inferior newcomers. Marble House challenged that hierarchy. It declared that industrial wealth could build on a scale that older families could not ignore. After Alva divorced William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1895, she retained control of Marble House. She later used the property for gatherings connected with the women's suffrage movement. That part of the house's history complicates the usual portrait of Vanderbilt excess. A building originally created as a monument to wealth later became a setting for political advocacy. Rough Point also survived. Built for Frederick William Vanderbilt and later associated with Doris Duke, it passed through different owners and eventually became a preserved historic property. Other estates changed uses, burned or entered long periods of uncertainty. Idle Hour on Long Island was built for William Kissam Vanderbilt. An earlier house on the estate burned, and a larger replacement was constructed. The property later became associated with Dowling College. The college eventually closed, leaving the estate's future uncertain and demonstrating another pattern in the history of these houses. Survival did not always mean preservation as a Vanderbilt residence. Some became schools, some became museums. Some were divided into institutional spaces. Some survived only because they could be adapted to a new purpose. The Vanderbilt Mansion in Hyde Park, New York, offers one of the clearest examples of a property that survived without attracting the same level of public attention as Biltmore or the Breakers. Frederick William Vanderbilt and his wife Louise acquired the property in the 1890s. They commissioned McKim, Mead, and White to design a new mansion overlooking the Hudson River. The resulting house contained 54 rooms and combined European-inspired decoration with modern systems for heating, plumbing, and household operation. Frederick was less publicly dramatic than some of his relatives. He managed his finances more cautiously and did not become known for the same kinds of social battles or scandals. That may be one reason his home receives less attention. History often remembers conflict, extravagance, and collapse more readily than restraint. But the Hyde Park estate survived partly because Frederick preserved his wealth more effectively than many other members of the family. After his death, the property eventually entered public ownership and became a national historic site. The survival of Hyde Park reveals something important. The disappearance of the Vanderbilt mansions was not inevitable in every case. Different choices, owners, and circumstances produced different outcomes. Some houses were maintained, some were donated, some were adapted. others stood on land that became too valuable for them to survive. Biltmore presents an even larger example. George Washington Vanderbilt purchased vast areas of land in western North Carolina and created an estate that eventually encompassed approximately 125,000 acres. The house itself was enormous, but George's project extended far beyond architecture. The estate included farms, gardens, managed forests, roads, workers' communities, and conservation experiments. Biltmore became closely connected with the development of scientific forestry in the United States. George and Edith Vanderbilt had already considered transferring a large portion of their managed forest to the federal government before George died unexpectedly in 1914. After his death, Edith completed the sale of approximately 86,000 acres. That land became an important part of what is now Pisgah National Forest. The transfer helped preserve George's forestry legacy while also reducing the enormous financial burden associated with maintaining the estate. It would be inaccurate to describe the sale as nothing more than desperation or debt. It reflected conservation goals, financial reality, and the practical challenge of sustaining a property larger than many towns. Biltmore itself survived by adapting. It eventually opened to paying visitors, developed commercial operations, and became one of the most recognizable historic estates in the country. That adaptability was crucial. A mansion can be built once, but it must be financed forever. Construction is only the beginning. There are roofs to repair, stone to clean, plumbing to replace, grounds to maintain, staff to pay, taxes to meet, and entire mechanical systems to modernize. The same scale that makes a mansion impressive can make it financially dangerous. That brings us to the most important question. Why did so many Vanderbilt houses disappear? The simple version of the story blames reckless heirs who spent everything. There is some truth in that, but it is incomplete. The Vanderbilt fortune fragmented across generations. William Henry had 8 children. Those children had families of their own. Each inheritance divided the wealth further. At the same time, the American financial system was changing. Income taxes, estate taxes, and new economic pressures made it more difficult to preserve 19th-century fortunes in the same form. The city also changed. Fifth Avenue was no longer simply a residential boulevard. Commercial buildings, hotels, and luxury retailers moved northward. A mansion might be architecturally priceless, but the land beneath it could be worth even more to a developer. Preservation law was also weak. Many of these houses were demolished before New York had established the protections that might later have delayed or prevented their destruction. Lifestyle changed as well. The enormous households of the Gilded Age depended on large domestic staffs. Later generations often preferred apartments, smaller houses, or country estates. Maintaining a 100-room mansion in the center of Manhattan no longer seemed desirable, even to wealthy heirs. The family still made choices. They could have attempted to preserve more of the houses. Some might have been donated, converted, or placed under institutional protection. But it would also be unfair to pretend that the Vanderbilts alone destroyed them through laziness or stupidity. The mansions disappeared through a collision of family decisions, divided wealth, changing taxes, rising land values, high operating costs, weak preservation laws, and a city moving rapidly into a new century. Gloria Vanderbilt's life is often used as evidence that the family fortune completely vanished. The truth is more complicated. Gloria inherited several $million through a trust and became the subject of a famous custody battle as a child. She was not poor. But compared with the enormous industrial fortune controlled by Cornelius and William Henry Vanderbilt, her inheritance represented only a small remnant of the original family wealth. She later built her own career as an artist, actress, designer, and businesswoman. Her success was not simply the result of living passively on the Vanderbilt name. Her son, Anderson Cooper, has repeatedly spoken skeptically about enormous inherited fortunes and the effect they can have on ambition. His comments are striking precisely because they come from someone connected to a family once defined by inheritance. But the Vanderbilt story is not really about the disappearance of every dollar. It is about the disappearance of concentrated power. Many descendants remained comfortable or wealthy. Some built successful careers. The name remained famous. What vanished was the unified fortune capable of controlling railroads, building palace-sized homes, and reshaping entire neighborhoods. That is the deeper meaning of the lost mansions. Each house was designed to communicate stability. Marble suggested permanence. Stone facades implied that the family had arrived and would remain for generations. But architecture cannot preserve a fortune by itself. A mansion does not prevent an inheritance from being divided. A ballroom cannot create family governance. A carved stone entrance cannot stop a neighborhood from becoming commercial. The houses looked permanent because that was their purpose. Their destruction revealed that permanence had always been an illusion. There is an old expression often used to describe generational wealth: shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The first generation creates the fortune. The second protects or enlarges it. The third grows up inside it and begins to spend or divide it. Eventually, descendants return to ordinary life. The phrase is too simple to explain every family, but the Vanderbilt history gives it extraordinary visual power. Cornelius built the empire. William Henry expanded it. Their descendants translated much of that wealth into residences, collections, and social influence. Then the fortune spread across a growing family, and the physical world built with that money began to disappear. Still, it would be a mistake to describe every mansion as a failure. The breakers survived and became a museum. Marble House preserved both Gilded Age architecture and part of the history of the suffrage movement. The Hyde Park mansion entered the national park system. Biltmore adapted into a business capable of supporting its continued preservation. The former Vanderbilt forests became part of a national forest enjoyed by the public. Even the demolished houses influenced American architecture, interior design, and urban history. Their disappearance is tragic, but their legacy is not meaningless. The real tragedy is that many were destroyed before Americans fully recognized the importance of preserving the recent past. Today, a medieval cathedral is obviously historic. A 2,000-year-old ruin is treated as irreplaceable. But in the 1920s, a 40-year-old Vanderbilt mansion could be dismissed as outdated, impractical, and ready for demolition. The people watching those buildings fall did not always see history disappearing. They saw old houses standing in the way of modern development. That is what makes the story relevant now. Every city contains buildings that seem ordinary because they are still present. Their value often becomes obvious only after they are gone. The Vanderbilt mansions remind us that age alone does not determine importance, and wealth alone does not guarantee survival. Some of the most expensive private homes ever constructed in America lasted less time than an ordinary family house. They were built by people who had enough money to imagine that they had escaped the normal limits of history. They had not. The mansions rose quickly, dazzled the public, and vanished. The stores, hotels, and office buildings that replaced them may one day vanish too. That is the final lesson of Vanderbilt Row. Fortunes can appear permanent. Families can appear untouchable. Buildings can look as though they were designed to survive forever. But wealth changes hands. Cities rebuild themselves. Tastes shift. Taxes rise. Families divide. Marble cracks. And sometimes all that remains of an American palace is a pair of gates standing in a public garden, guarding a mansion that no longer exists.